We do have, brothers, more copies of his book, The Creedal Imperative. Please take one. Even if you already have a copy and maybe you have an elder or another brother in the church that you think would benefit, please go ahead and take a copy and gift it to them. Maybe we'll start, if I could start with just a question of my own, and then we'll open up to questions. For those of us who are either subscribed to a particular confession or have no particular but may have a modern statement, what do you think about how we use confessions and creeds from other traditions, thinking through the history of, especially post-Reformation, just the flurry of confessions? How can those be incorporated? Should we? I'm a Reformed Baptist, 1689. Should I care about the Heidelberg Catechism and the Canons of Dort? And how would I utilize those, do you think?
Good question. It depends on the creed or confession, but I think they can be used in a variety of ways. One, I always recommend it to students at seminary, and I even do it now to the students in my Doctrine of God class at Grove, to collect creeds and confessions. Get hold of the Book of Concord. Get hold of the Roman Catholic Catechism. Get hold of creeds and confessions as you come across them, because first of all, it's a great education in what other Christians believe and getting a sort of the lay of the land. But also there's much there that's useful. I'm thinking when I was dealing with, this is sort of slightly distasteful topic, I suppose, but I was having to deal with I was writing something on pornography at some point, and the Roman Catholic Catechism has the best definition of pornography that I've ever come across. It's very hard to define pornography, but the Roman Catholic Catechism had a superb definition. So there's an awful lot of what I would call Christian wisdom in the creeds and confessions that can be used generally. In terms of church-wise, the Heidelberg Catechism is particularly beautiful in its pastoral tone, and I've seen that used in a sort of almost liturgically responsive way in congregations. The Heidelberg Catechism also has the great advantage that it was divided pretty early on into 52 Lord's Days and became a kind of preaching grid for the continental Reformed churches. The Heidelberg Catechism therefore provides an interesting model of how to sort of preach the whole counsel of God over a period of a year, which I think is quite important today when populations are pretty mobile and people tend to, bow in and out of churches with remarkable regularity. So the Heidelberg Catechism would be a great example of how you could use a confession or a catechism from another tradition to enrich the pedagogical strategy in your own church. So those would be some examples. And I just find it very helpful to know what has been the historic position of certain churches. The Anglican 39 Articles, very helpful. They all of these documents summarize beautifully aspects of the faith. And I think every church should have one set of standards, otherwise it becomes administratively and procedurally confusing. But we should take full advantage of the broad sweep of confessional and creedal history.
Excellent, thank you. Kyle.
First, can you be sure with the questions, the repeats for recording?
Good point, thank you.
Carl, so in the Westminster Standards, there's the shorter catechism and the longer catechism. And I appreciated your point about a sort of lower bar for members coming in. Do they believe and can they confess the gospel? Tom Askell's church uses the Second London for elders, and not just for offices, but for any teachers as the teaching standard. They use the New Hampshire for members coming in. Two-part question. In the Presbyterian tradition, are there examples of having a shorter, condensed version of the confession, like there is in the Catechism, for members versus officers in teaching? And then the second part is whether or not there are those historical examples, just your thoughts on having a shorter, condensed, written, for all the reasons you said it's good to have the codified confession that's maybe briefer but consistent.
Right.
I'm not repeating that because it was too elaborate and confusing. Please explain a little further about membership in the Presbyterian system and the use of a shorter potential confession.
I'm not aware of the production of a shorter confession for members. That's not to say it hasn't happened, but I'm not aware of it. What we have in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church and the PCA is very similar. We have a series of questions that members have to ask. Off the top of my head, I cannot remember them all, but one of them is about the Trinity, one of them is about salvation atonement, one of them is about submitting to the elders in the Lord. So there is, I would say, an implicit small core of doctrine that has to be believed by members that is reflected in the background of this handful of questions. I think there are 5 questions that members have to answer. So that would be how we address that. It's not that there is a separate document, but it's that those 5 questions really point to particular aspects of the Westminster Confession that are regarded as non-negotiable for membership of the Church. So that would be my answer to that. And I would think that Tom Askell's use of the summary functions in a very similar way. And again, go back to a comment I made in the lectures. I talked about the function. If you don't have creeds and confessions, you need something that functions the same way. And that sounds to me as if what he's doing there and what our church is doing relative to questions is the same way of getting, is a different way of getting at the same thing.
Good. Randy?
Very importantly, regarding adhering and meeting the confessional standards, what's your opinion about Steve's shoes?
Oh, his opinion about my shoes? Hey, these are original Chuck Taylors. These are good. This is American.
I can tell. I think they're very American.
Yeah.
Actually, that could be a Fifth Amendment thing for me, I think, actually.
I'm sorry, brother. Don't know your name. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
What if you could expand a little bit on using formalized kind of creed in Sunday morning worship service, knowing that some people are really turned off by the formalism. They just think it's rote. And so what's your advice on how to incorporate it, or if we should?
Yeah, it's interesting. The question is one about incorporating creeds in worship. How does one go about that, given that some people have an almost instinctive recoil from that because it can lead to formalism, etc., etc. The classic answer to any question like that, of course, is, well, every situation is different, so you may have to adopt a different strategy. A couple of things, though, come to mind. One, certainly, if it is not the tradition of your church and you want to move in that direction, then teaching is going to be important. Teaching about why you're going to make this move is important. Don't just do it cold, but try to draw people along. And I think of Martin Luther. And Martin Luther calls for a vernacular liturgy in 1520. But he does not introduce a full German liturgy in Wittenberg until 1525. 5 years. And he says there are 2 reasons for doing that. One, he can't get the music right. He wants German-sounding music for German words. But 2, he says the people are already disturbed enough by what's going on in the Reformation. And so I'm only going to change things at a pace they can cope with, which is often not the approach taken in Reformed circles, which is, as soon as we get a great idea, let's change it next Sunday. And it's why we split so many churches and do so much damage, to be honest. I used to use Luther as an example for students at seminary. I'd say, when you become a pastor, don't change anything for 5 years, unless there's heresy involved. If there's damnable heresy, it's got to change. If it's that the church has a choir and you don't like choirs, don't change it on the first. Build the personal capital and try to bring people along in a gentle way. So I'd say, first of all, teaching. Secondly, how do you teach people on this? Well, I would say there are various ways that I would try to persuade people that saying creeds and confessions are good things to use in worship. There are some positive things that one can say along the lines that I was trying to outline just now. It's a way of expressing identity with other Christians, etc., etc. Perhaps there's something that the congregation hold dear that you could persuade them is best protected or maintained by the use of the very thing that they're reacting against. So if I was trying to persuade a congregation to adopt a confession, I'd want to say, the supreme authority of Scripture, which is why you don't want to adopt a confession, is actually best protected by having a confession. And here's why. So maybe there would be equivalent there. And I would also use that sort of Socratic method of, you're worried about using a formalistic set of words. Well, what about hymns? As I did in my lecture, we sing hymns, and every time we sing A Mighty Fortress by Luther, we're singing the same words we did last time. There's a danger of formalism there. The danger of formalism doesn't come from the fact it's a hymn that we repeat. It comes from the heart with which we repeat it. So I would try to persuade people that the things they're rightfully concerned about, one might say, we want to acknowledge the legitimacy of the concern, but then persuade them that the concern is misplaced. So that's what I would try to do as a broad strategy. Now that might look different in any given church depending on the personalities and the histories you're up against. But that's how I would try to go about it. Try to be persuasive and also take the view of the important thing is to get to the right place. It's not to get to the right place next Sunday. But we can take time to teach on this stuff. When some years ago, the church I was pastoring, I had a couple of elders who felt very strongly that we should have real wine in communion. And we were a grape juice church. And I remember at the session meeting saying, we're not going to split the church on this. I know you guys feel very passionately about it, but whatever strategy we adopt on this, we are not splitting the church. So we decided, I can't remember the exact, okay, we're going to take 18 months to get to this point. First of all, we're going to talk to the people we know in the congregation who are recovered alcoholics. We're going to talk to them and see if they have issues and problems. Then maybe we're going to get some sermons done on it. And we're not going to do anything that makes the congregation feel they've been railroaded. We're going to move slowly but surely. And we got there. But it took us about 18 months. And we did it without splitting the congregation. So I would imagine a similar slow and steady strategy. And in my mind, I was always thinking, in my pastorate, what I'm doing is doing stuff so the next pastor doesn't have to do it. So if when I leave the church, we've got these things in play, that's a good result. I don't need them in play next week. I need to be able to hand them on to the next guy.
Oh, that's excellent. Thank you. Other questions, brothers? Go ahead.
Yes, it's in a similar vein as that question, but I love using ecumenical creeds and things that all Christians to be Christian agree on, like the Nicene Creed and liturgies. But how do you go about using things like confessions in the liturgy that maybe some of your congregation don't agree with, and also even maybe using prayers of church fathers and that kind of stuff that aren't inspired? How do you, would you agree? Would you say we should use those or not?
Good question. I mean, I think it's interesting you say creeds that all Christians agree on, because the Apostles' Creed, descended into hell. That's going to be one. You're always going to have somebody in your crowd saying, I don't believe that. It's a bad translation, of course. And there again, teaching comes in. I want to teach on that. So, but if you don't feel you can say that, that's okay. Just be quiet. I don't want you to act against your conscience. But I'm going to teach on it and show you why it's actually not problematic. So that might be one thing to do there. I think the way that I've seen confessions used is, by and large, the bits of the confessions that have been used liturgically have tended not to be the bits on which congregants have disagreed. So I've never been in a Presbyterian church where we tried to use the Q&A on baptism in the catechisms as part of the worship service. Not that it couldn't be done, but I've just not seen it done. So I would say that one would tend, when one's using these more specific confessions, my instinct would be to try to go for the more ecumenical dimensions of them anyway, for the very reasons that you've mentioned. There was a second part to your question.
Prayers from church fathers.
Prayers from church fathers. This may sound mischievous, but I'm inclined to say I'd do it and not tell anybody I was doing it. If I'm doing it from the pulpit, if we're doing it as part of the worship, I've been at churches where congregations have recited written prayers, and they've come from all over the place, and I've never had any major pushback on that front. But I would say if you're using, Thomas Aquinas has some lovely prayers, but if you're worried about using Aquinas because somebody will say, didn't he believe in transubstantiation? Well, one, I wouldn't recommend using a prayer on transubstantiation. But two, maybe you just want to refer to it as a 13th century prayer. You could do that. And that actually reflects, one of the questions I've often had at these sort of talks is, we don't have a confession. How do we move a church in that direction? And one strategy I've suggested adopting from the pulpit is, preach as you preach, and then get in the habit of dropping in, oh, by the way, this is summarized in this document, the Westminster Confession, in the following way. So that people over a period of a couple of years get used to hearing, wow, yeah, that really summarized that point nicely. Preparing the congregation then for saying, actually, maybe we should adopt a confession.
That's helpful. Jason?
Yeah. Thank you so much for being here. I like your shoes. I like your socks.
Thanks.
I 100% agree with you. Sound words is important. I asked you this in the back, and you told me to bring it up here. But words mean different things to different people. We talked a little bit about Wittgenstein, the philosopher of words. He did the word games to his students. He would say, like, everybody think, I'm going to say a sentence, and he would say, the pineapple is pleasant. And he would say, everybody in here has a different pineapple in their head, based on two things: the pineapples that they've seen, and also their definition of the word pleasant. In my Reformed circle, local church that I go to, I like asking the question whether the person's 19 or 86, like, what's your goal of life? And they quote to me what you guys think, what you guys would quote would be, the chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. And then I ask the question, well, what does that mean? And it's always different. I'm sure in this circle right now, I ask, what's the goal of your life? And you guys would say, chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. And then I would ask, what does that mean? I'm sure there's going to be some differences here. So what would you say to that?
Yeah, a couple of things. Well, one, there is the general question or issue that I touched on, that words change meaning over time. A great example, as we talked about in the back, is actually the formulation of what we call the Nicene Creed. It was actually put together at the Council of Constantinople in 381. The movements to formulating it start at Nicaea in 325. What's interesting is in 325, they anathematize anybody who says there are three hypostases, this Greek word, in God. In 381, they anathematize anyone who says there's only one hypostasis in God. Why the change? Have they completely changed their minds? No, the word has changed its meaning. So, first of all, there is important sort of linguistic archaeology that needs to be done. When you're looking at these ancient documents, or 6th, 17th century documents, like the word stew, it is important that we understand the words as they were being used in the time. Secondly, to the broader question of, well, how do we overcome this fact that these creeds and confessions could be, or the words could be understood in very different ways? Enjoy God. The word enjoy, it's one of the reasons why I've always struggled. Nothing against John Piper. Never been a huge John Piper fan. He's never really, hey, I'm English, and he's a very emotional American. We don't connect. But it's one of the reasons why I've always struggled a little bit with this Christian hedonism, because hedonism brings into my mind all kinds of connotations that just strike me as more confusing than clarifying on that issue. But what I would say there is when you have and again, I don't want to sound too much like Wittgenstein here, but I think he's sort of helpful, that these words actually do come to have accepted meanings within communities. And okay, we have the, enjoy God, we have that phrase, glorify God and enjoy him forever. We have that phrase, and you could ask a dozen people what that means, get a dozen different answers. But that phrase doesn't exist in isolation. That catechetical question and answer is going to be part of the life of the church as a community, which isn't just the catechism. It's also the hymns. It's also the structure of the worship service. It's the preaching from the pulpit. It's the pulpit prayers. It's the interactions that people have within that community. And that gives that statement some shape. So I would say you're right in that catechetical question. You can't simply look up the words in the dictionary and understand what it means. It means something because it's part of a way of life. Again, I hate to use a sort of Wittgenstein kind of language, but I think he is onto something. That it's part of a way of life that can't be understood purely in terms of the catechism. I think that religious communities, we are, what defines a church? We're defined by creed, code, and cult. We have a creed that we believe. We have a code that shapes the way we live our lives and interact with each other and is not disconnected from the creed. And we have a cult. We have a form of worship. And all three, each one helps give meaning and content to the other. So I would say, yeah, if we look at creeds and confessions as purely linguistic and we isolate them just in terms of their language, then what you're describing can be a very real problem. But if we actually say, well, actually we need to understand these things as part of the broader life of the church, then over time, hopefully in your church, the distance between what the 80-year-old and the 15-year-old thinks of as worshiping God and enjoying Him forever, that distance will close as the individuals grow in grace. And then, of course, we add the thing that we can never quantify, but is very real, and that's the supernatural. Church is not just a linguistic community, it's also the place inhabited by the Holy Spirit, so we can expect the Lord to be transforming our minds. Maybe we'll never reach a point where everybody in our church agrees in every detail on what glorify God and enjoy Him forever means, but we'll get to the point where there's a pretty close consensus on that.
Maybe if I could piggyback on that and think about the church in its outward facing towards society, and your first point about the legal defense that brought to mind the Sunday after the Obergefell decision in 2015, we had our local NBC News crew right out front here, and they wanted to interview the pastor, and I was out there, and the reporter was quite, I think, as you would say, in a cheeky way, saying, "We've heard some Christians don't agree with this decision. Would you like to?"
Like every Christian of the last 2,000 years,
right.
but other than that, until the day before yesterday. Yeah.
Would you like to, could we interview you? And I, of course, declined. I didn't want our church building burned down on Monday. And I just said, look, our definition of marriage was codified in our confession in 1689. It hasn't changed last Friday. You're welcome to read it, and you're welcome to join us. Although as I've been thinking about that interaction and the benefit of a confession in that sense, when you look at the chapter on marriage, which is not too dissimilar from Westminster's, there's words that have changed meaning. Marriage itself, man and woman now we have to define. Does that raise the issue at all of confessional expansion, revision, or do we just footnote it or write position papers, or how would you suggest?
It's a good question. I think first of all, I would always be theoretically open to confessional revision. And indeed, the Westminster Confession, as I subscribe in the United States, is different from the one I subscribe as an elder in the Free Church of Scotland. The Establishment Clause, the idea that the Prince can convene synods, has been removed because it's an American document, not a Scottish document. I shy away from confessional revision, partly because I think historically that always opens a can of worms. Once the stable door is open, the horse can bolt. So I prefer to think about what I call confessional sufficiency. That my first thought is, when a new issue pops up, is the confession actually sufficient to deal with this? And I would say, on marriage, yes. Now, okay, man and woman has changed its meaning, but guess what? The confession is a chapter on creation. We can get to these different things by looking at the thing as a whole. But if, let's say, something came up and that was no longer the case, what would we do about, Well, I would say a couple of things. One, if we're going to revise the confession, then it has to be done ecclesiastically. And it has to be done very carefully. And that's done by, in a Presbyterian context, the General Assembly setting up a study committee, the study committee producing reports, and then the church itself deciding whether to change the confession or not. We have a similar thing. It's not a confessional revision, but in the PCA at the moment, for anybody following the Presbyterian Church in America debates, the Assembly just took the decision to revise its Book of Church Order to say that no pastoral candidate who identifies as gay, and it's careful to be what we're saying here. We're not saying that no pastoral candidate who struggles with homosexual temptation is disqualified from ministry. It's anybody who actually sees that as their identity cannot go forward for ministry. In some ways it's a fine, but it's an important distinction. The church has decided that they're going to add a clause that says nobody who takes gay as an identification is qualified for ministry, going through ministry in the Presbyterian Church in America. That has then got to go back to the presbyteries, and 2/3 of the presbyteries have to approve that change, and then it goes back to the General Assembly and has to be approved by a simple majority of the General Assembly next year. The reason that process is arcane is we don't want important changes being waved through by a simple majority. You happen to pack an assembly one year and you get a major change through. You want, as Americans say, you want checks and balances to make sure that it's done properly. In Scotland, it's what they call the Barrier Act. The General Assembly proposes something, but then a majority of the presbyteries have to reaffirm it in order for it to then come back to the General Assembly for approval. So the process needs to be carefully guarded so that we're not changing the confession every year. The OPC, by the way, we produce our Book of Church Order. It's hardbound. And we can only revise our Book of Church Order, I think, every 5 years. And that's great. That's good because it prevents, the PCA Book of Church is about this thick. It's ring bound. They just keep adding stuff to it. Ours is very thin, hardbound, very difficult to change. So there would be a mechanism. My preference, though, would be for study committees to say, okay, do what and if you haven't seen it, you may find the Reformed Presbyterian Church of North America has produced 2 reports on human sexuality and on gender that are extremely helpful to Christians. And you can get them online, and they're very, very useful. My preference is always say, okay, we've got an issue on marriage, and it may well be that many of our pastors need help in understanding exactly what the confession is saying or what the applications and implications of that confession may be in this particular circumstance. I think on the gay marriage issue, it's pretty obvious, but let's say IVF. Many of us wonder what does the confession say about in vitro fertilization? It doesn't say anything at all, but what implications does the confession have for that? The church would then not add a clause on IVF to the confession because IVF might disappear as an issue in 100 years' time. Who knows? What the church would do is produce a report that effectively gives advice to pastors on these are the implications for this issue. And I prefer that because it doesn't open that stable door for the horse to bolt. Because historically, confessional revision has tended always to drift leftward. It doesn't have to do that. There's nothing required for it to do that. But by and large, it has tended to do that.
That's helpful. Thank you. Other questions, brothers? Yes, sir.
A comment. In our church is identified as a non-denominational church. Its history is a Baptist church. The confessional you're talking about is actually one we're studying right now, just to encourage our people, the 1869, to understand where our Constitution is. We've set a Constitution up through an elder board identifying what the belief is of our church. And, as you're talking about gay marriage and stuff, it specifically talks about requirements for marriage. And the scripture that backs it up is our legal document to substantiate where we're at if we came into a legal position where somebody was challenging that position in the church. And so it's not a confession, it's actually just it's a constitution of the position of the church.
Yeah, it's really helpful. Study papers, position papers, and legally constitutional. As far as the government looks at us, that's what they look at as an organization. Yeah, it's helpful. Sir, go ahead.
Yeah, I've thoroughly enjoyed this morning, as far as enjoy is concerned. It's exciting to me that you were invited to Provo, Utah, huh? And I was just wondering in your private conversations if you've been able to banter back and forth any doctrine with anybody that would come up to you and have any questions?
It was a flying visit, and it was my first exposure to the Latter-day Saints, other than occasionally having them knock on my door over the years. So I confess I didn't actually know an awful lot about their theology. They're sending me a bucket load of books through the mail. They told me yesterday, we got all these books for you, if you could mail them to me. What I noticed was last night my wife and I were just talking about this experience, and we had a lovely experience, and we actually made a couple of contacts there with people that I think will be friends. We had some lovely conversations. I think these people will be friends. And we would like to be friends because we would like to develop the kind of conversations you're talking about, among other things. Not that we just see them as evangelistic opportunities. They're generally nice people. And we have interests in common. But I was very much trying to just get the lay of the land. And my wife said to me, it was interesting, she said they were clearly trying to evangelize us at points. That was not my impression. I said, I don't think they were trying to evangelize us. What they were trying to do was minimize the differences. That they kept talking about, we Christians need to stand together. And I was very careful in my response to, I was talking about religious conservatives need to stand together. Because we were talking about legal and cultural issues. And the Latter-day Saints I was talking to, they are culturally conservative people. They value family very much, and they are being torn apart by, I chatted to two mothers whose kids are transitioning from gender. I'm having the same heartbreaking conversations with them I've had with others in the broader Christian community. They're facing the same kind of issues. So I was really there to get the lay of the land and to help them think through those issues from a cultural perspective. But it was interesting to me that the impression I got was they want to be considered part of the broader Christian consensus in the United States. And yet, when I looked up the Christian doctrine, it's clearly very different. And the one conversation I did have was I talked about, I was interested in getting their take on contraception, because they all have big families. Do they have a similar view to the Roman Catholics? And it was very interesting to me that no, their big families derive from their understanding of the pre-existence of souls. I think they call it the premortal. There's a word they used for it, might be premortal. And that struck me as interesting. So I was really just trying to get the lay of the land in where they stood. I did comment to my wife, though, that wow, if they were friendly, modest, humble, family-loving, hard-working people who give a lot of time to their religious institution. And I remember saying, well, man, if my congregation in Philly if half of them had been like these people, it would have been amazing. And it made me understand why Mormon evangelism is so hard. Two reasons. One, they use exactly the same words as we do. I mean, the prayers that were said, I can say amen to those prayers, but I know you don't mean the same thing that I do. And secondly, outwardly, they're pretty much everything you'd want a Christian to be. They were such lovely, it was sort of almost heartbreaking. They were such lovely people. It was kind of heartbreaking. Wow, we are so far apart, and yet you are such wonderful people. So it was an interesting experience from that perspective. And BYU said they're going to invite me back, so it will probably not be my last. Next time, I'm going to have done a lot more reading, and I think I'm going to be much happier in saying, okay. The one question I did ask them was, why don't you drink coffee?
That's a good question.
The response was, because God told us not to, it's habit forming. I said, well, why did God tell you that? They said, because it's habit forming. And then later, the lady said that she enjoyed ice cream. She got an ice cream habit. And I said, so God didn't ban everything that's habit forming then, you know? And they said, no, I guess not. I guess God just doesn't want us to drink coffee. That was the answer. So.
Maybe somewhat along those lines, you have a fairly Catholic seemingly disposition. In the podcast, you'll have Roman Catholics on.
Yep.
You've mentioned and recommended the books by Archbishop Charles Chaput.
Yep.
And you interact very well with others, and we represent a broad variety of traditions. Maybe reiterate again in practice the use of confessional subscription,
Yeah.
nailing your colors to the Mass, how that helps you in that.
Yeah.
And maybe also piggybacking on that, we're going to give out tomorrow your pamphlet, The Real Scandal of the Evangelical
Oh, yeah,
Mind.
yeah.
And at the end of that, I think you're making the same argument as DJ Hart, correct me if I'm wrong, that evangelicalism as such doesn't really exist. We're a collection of ecclesial communities that have some label put over us. So how does that distinction of, you're a Presbyterian, I'm a Baptist, that means something, but yet we still have fellowship, partnership, and cooperation?
Well, first, a couple of things, the Roman Catholic context. First of all, a lot of the issues I deal with, Roman Catholics have done the best writing on it. I mean, we are way behind in terms of ethics and moral thinking. These days, I say to students, if you want to do a PhD, do it in ethics. Because Protestantism, we are well behind the curve on ethics. Catholicism has done a lot more thinking about Carter Sneed, a friend of mine, teaches at Notre Dame. Carter's book, What It Means to Be Human, is an outstanding treatment of beginning of life, fertility, and end of life issues. I would recommend any Christian to read. So part of the reason for the sort of Catholic connection is very much the ethic and moral stuff. Secondly, I've always made a distinction in my mind between individual Christians who love Jesus and whose company I love and delight in, and the churches they may belong to. I'm very happy to have one-on-one personal Christian fellowship with an individual whose church I could never join. And I would put many of my Catholic friends into that kind of bracket. Can't abide the church, but I know individual Catholics who, frankly, seem a whole lot more orthodox on a lot of key things than a lot of evangelicals do. Thirdly, on evangelicalism, I do think, and I think more so now than ever, it's become this social construct. And it annoys me when people identify evangelicalism with sort of hardcore Trump kind of stuff. And that's not a criticism of Trump at all. It's just that evangelicalism should not be a political label, but to the press, it's become this way of, well, anyone who's a conservative Christian has got to be has got to be there on January the 6th rioting at the Capitol Hill, or they're doing that because they claim to love Jesus, etc., etc. So I think evangelicalism has become in public a problematic term. But then when the Ligonier do these surveys every couple of years, and like only 60% of evangelicals believe Jesus was God. Well, Robert's probably the same as me. I cut my teeth in Britain where, the word evangelical to me meant J.I. Packer and Martin Lloyd-Jones. You say evangelical, that's what it means to me. It doesn't have political connotations. It means basic agreement on the gospel. And so that, I think, is where the term in America is very problematic. In it's this sort of sociological term, and it's just used in a whole variety of different ways. And I don't identify as an evangelical here, but I have to say to people, but I would identify as an evangelical back home. Because back home it means J.I. Packer, and he's a hero of mine, and I want to identify with J.I. Packer. I don't want to identify with the Trinity Broadcasting Network, or I don't want to identify with some Republican senator who claims to be evangelical, and then you find out he lives this terribly God-denying life. And yet that's the label that comes out at election time because that brings in the constituency. So that would be my problem with that. And then the other aspect, the sort of D.G. Hart aspect, would be, evangelicalism, even theologically, is still a bit of a construct. And ultimately, one has to belong to a church. You can't belong to evangelicalism. J.I. Packer was an Anglican. So ultimately, he's an Anglican. His theology is evangelical, but he's really an Anglican. And J.I. Packer was a hero of mine. I was converted reading a book of his. In about 2012, I had the honor of flying out to Vancouver to give him an honorary doctorate for Westminster. I had to phone him up when he answered the phone. Well, his wife answered the phone, she put him on. I couldn't speak. He must have thought I was creepy, heavy breathing guy, because he comes on the phone and I don't know what to say. I got my hero on the end of the phone and I have nothing to say to him. The only other time that happened to me was when I met Joe Frazier, the former world heavyweight boxer in Philadelphia. Didn't know what to say to him either. He was another hero. But I flew out and I spent the day with him, which was fun. And somebody said, "You wrote for my Festschrift, didn't you?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "You were the one man who criticized me." And I said, "Yeah." And he said, I felt embarrassed at this point. I said, "Yeah, I did. It was terrible." And he said, what did I do wrong?" And I said, "You should have been a Presbyterian." And that was the one moment in the day when there was this flash of anger. And he poked his finger at me and he said, "I'm an Anglican by conviction." And then he calmed down again. But I got the last laugh because the last book that he wrote, which has just been published, Legacy of Anglican Theology, it's a wonderful book of theology. I was asked to do a jacket commendation for it. And I said, on the back, Joe Blow said, "Joe Packer should have been a Presbyterian, but he was an Anglican. This is a good service." So I feel I got the last laugh on that one in the end.
That's great. Any last question, brothers? Jesse?
Yeah, just as you're talking about how important it is to get the language right and be sincere in the words and nail that down. How do you pair that also with where Paul talks about not wrangling about words?
Yeah.
And that, I know it's back-to-back verses, get the sound doctrine right.
Yeah.
But don't wrangle about words. And can you kind of...
Yeah, and I certainly think in the context of our own churches today, I mean, that text is often used to say we shouldn't debate and discuss doctrine. And yet, when you put that together with what Paul's saying in Romans, or what Jude says, it's very clear that, yeah, we should wrangle about doctrine because it's important. I think Paul there, I think the two things we need to avoid is, one, we need to avoid making fine, non-essential distinctions essential. That there is a place, and I've changed my opinion on this over the years, actually, I've softened. There is a place for mere Christianity in the way we act as Christians. I think there is. And that's why I'm able now to appreciate some of my Catholic friends in a way that 20 years ago I'd have been very suspicious of that, but now I think, no, because I make some ecclesiastical distinctions, I'm able to enjoy one-on-one fellowship in a way that I could not join the Catholic Church, for example. And I think what Paul is getting at there is the kind of uncharitable wrangling that makes non-essentials essential. And also I think that there's a background of that, church history does have people who wrangle over words that ultimately don't mean anything. And yet people do tie themselves into knots over them. When language becomes detached from reality, we can start to wrangle over the precise way something is expressed rather than what is actually being expressed. And I think it's a warning to us there that, again, the fact that you may express something differently to me may not mean that conceptually we're not on the same page, and we shouldn't fall out over different ways of expressing something. To take a lot of my closest theological friends would be in the United Reformed Church, which holds the three forms of unity. And I affirm the substance of the three forms of unity, even though I prefer on the whole the way the Westminster Confession expresses those concepts. So that's what I would go for. But in some circles, and perhaps certainly in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church and perhaps in Reformed Baptist circles, our fault is not typically that we whitewash over differences. It's that we're constantly on the lookout for new differences that we can fall out over. And I think that's probably what Paul is getting at there. One of my colleagues has a great map of church history. He's a Presbyterian, and it's a really anti-Baptist map, I suppose, but it's all about the true line is the true Baptists coming through the minute, and then you've got heretics, you've got Presbyterians, then you've got Baptists who aren't true Baptists, and you have this sort of branch, and eventually you've got just the pure Baptist, brackets 35 guys in Texas or something like this at the bottom. Protestant history in general has often tended to fragment over things that aren't that important. I mean, to having just had a knock at the Baptists, in America, I could name at least 5 Presbyterian denominations off the top of my head that have substantially the same doctrine and substantially the same terms of subscription. But we're separate denominations, and we're not making any moves to union at this point. And that makes a nonsense. I think when Christ calls for church unity, he's not just talking about spiritual unity, which is what Protestants tend to default to. I think he's talking about something more tangible than that we as Presbyterians tend to ignore. I mean, we're happy in the OPC to unite as Presbyterians if all the other Presbyterian churches dissolve and join the OPC. And I think that, maybe that too is at the back of Paul's mind, that the fragmentation we experience, which has weakened us, is problematic at some level.
Would you give a brief word on just subscription in general to confessions? I know you've got like PCA Good Faith. Is OPC strict, substantial? Or how would you define it?
We're pretty strict. We don't allow what we call, though I have colleagues who'll talk about taking exceptions in the OPC. We don't take, an exception is where you say, I disagree with the doctrine in this. And typically, there is no one way of doing subscription that is true. I think one thing I disagree with in the PCA allows individuals to take exceptions as long as they don't teach them. And I think that what that is, you say, I disagree with this bit of the confession, but I'm not going to teach it. I think that, and the conservatives like that. I have more sympathy in some ways with the progressives on that point, because I think saying that a man can object to something in the confession but not allowing him to teach it might be pushing him to a position where he has to be dishonest in the pulpit, and also might be practically impossible. Okay, he never teaches it from the pulpit, but he's standing at the water cooler one day and somebody says to him, hey, pastor, what do you believe about X? If he gives an honest answer to that, is he teaching? Is he teaching it? So I'm not keen on that. I'm of a belief that if you allow somebody to take an exception to the confession, you should allow them to teach that exception, as long as they say they're teaching an exception. Don't stand in the pulpit and say, I believe this and it's consistent with the Westminster Confession when it isn't. Make it clear it's an exception. And if you don't want them teaching that exception, then don't allow them to take it. If somebody says, well, actually, I take an exception to the divinity of Jesus Christ, well, okay, you can't be a minister in the PCA then. In the OPC, we don't allow exceptions, but we do allow what we call scruples. And it's actually important. A scruple is effectively a disagreement with an application of the doctrine. And I take a scruple. And my scruple is to the teaching of the larger catechism on the Lord's Day. And that I agree that there is a 1 day in 7 principle. I agree that the day is shifted from Saturday to Sunday. But I disagree with what I regard as the extreme teaching on Sunday observance, which I actually think is practically impossible, of the larger catechism. So what effectively I'm saying is I agree with the Lord's Day teaching of the confessional standards, but I disagree with the fact that, I don't think that every moment of the conscious waking day should be spent in acts of devotion, private and public. I think it's perfectly legitimate to have a sleep on a Sunday afternoon. It's perfectly legitimate to have students round to my house after church for a meal, and for us not just to talk about the sermon we've heard, but for me to catch up and find out how they're doing and to build friendships within the church. And that would be regarded as a scruple, because I'm not contradicting the doctrine of the confession. I'm actually saying I think the applications go beyond what the Bible teaches. What I couldn't do is say, I don't agree with the Lord's Day. That would be an exception, and that would not be acceptable.
That's helpful. Thank you. Is there one last question, and we'll wrap up here, or we covered the bases for the most part? Well, Dr. Trueman, thank you again so much. I went to a non-confessional theological school and came out that way, and it was actually your essay on Reformation 21, No Good Creed Goes Unpunished, that first got me thinking.
I can't even remember that one, but I'm glad you sure it was me that wrote it.
Yeah, you wrote it.
Okay.
Yeah. And I read that, and it got me thinking. And so here I am years later pastoring in a confessional context, and appreciate your ministry and the contribution you even make to us lowly Baptists, the last true left here in Sacramento.
You have all the best preachers, Baptists. You're not lowly at all.
You're not the first Presbyterian to tell me that, actually.
We have the best books of church order, but hey.
To conclude our time, Pastor Jeff Oliver, can I ask you to lead us in prayer and then close our time together, brother? Thank you so much.